This is Michael Popok, and by the looks of things, it's Legal AF After Dark. We have to talk about Hunter Biden's conviction on this network. We have no choice. It shows what the justice system can do when it doesn't show any fear or favor towards the powerful. The Republicans are busy saying that when Donald Trump was prosecuted, it's a witch hunt, it's lawless. It shows our criminal justice system has become weaponized, it's lawfare. But then, of course, when the son of a president gets convicted and still being prosecuted for tax crimes out in California, when he gets convicted, it's the jury system is doing the right thing and doing its job. Or no, there's a broader case here against Hunter Biden. I mean, leave the poor guy alone. He's already admitted to being a crack addict. He's already admitted that he is an addict for the rest of his life and he's trying to get his life back, and that for 11 days he had a handgun. I mean, is this really a proper use of prosecutorial resources? I asked my colleague, Karen Friedman Agnifilo, on the recent Legal AF, and here's our discussion. Let's talk about Hunter Biden to close out our podcast, Karen. Why don't you take it from the prosecutor's standpoint? Let me ask you a question. There's been a lot of reporting about how Abby Lowell and others for the defense handled the case. They put on the sister, they put on the daughter. This was about whether Hunter Biden, at the time he was a crack addict, lied on a series of forms and to a gun dealer about his being a drug user, and he got a weapon. He had the weapon. This is all established facts for 11 days. His wife at the time threw the gun away, but he had the gun and he acquired the gun. And so that is the case. The rest of these people that kind of went on, and some jurors have already been interviewed. What did you think about it? What did you think about what it says about our jury criminal justice system, whether it works or doesn't work? Talk about it from the prosecutor using prosecutorial discretion to go after Hunter Biden for this, Merrick Garland appointing a special counsel for this, and then the outcome. I think it's, from your perspective, will be quite fascinating for our audience.
So a couple things. First of all, I just want to point out the irony. So 18 United States Code 922 is basically a federal gun possession statute that lists A, B, C, D, all these different prohibitions on who cannot lawfully possess a firearm, despite the possession of a weapon essentially being a constitutional right. Okay, the Second Amendment guarantees us the right to bear arms. And I think, but there are all sorts of prohibitions to that, or requirements to that, even on the federal level. States all have different laws because you can regulate kind of how it happens in the state. As you pointed out, Florida basically says you don't need a permit. New York says you do to have a concealed carry, and it's pretty stringent. But the irony, the thing I want to point out is there are a few people who cannot possess one emphatically. One is a felon, right? If you're a felon, if you've been convicted of a felony and you're in possession of a firearm, it's called felon in possession. Those are cases that are brought every single day by federal prosecutors. It's they call it trigger lock sometimes. It's literally, how do you put dangerous criminals away for gun possession? They charge them with the felon in possession. The reason I say it's ironic is because Donald Trump is now a convicted felon, and he's been convicted in New York State. He is technically a felon in possession with respect to the one gun that we talked about, that you talked about earlier, that is unaccounted for, that is listed on his gun permit that is in the process of being revoked. It doesn't matter if he's in Florida or anywhere else. If he's in possession of a gun and he's a convicted felon, he can be guilty of this federal crime. Now, there are there's really kind of, there's really one caveat to that. And then I'll get back to the Hunter thing, which is, at what stage are you convicted convicted of a felony? Is it upon verdict, or do you have to wait until after sentence? And there's a case that says it's at the point of conviction, but I do know in other areas, like if you are going to be adjudicated what's called a predicate felon in New York, you have to have been sentenced for that prior felony. So that's going to be a point of contention. But he better get rid of that gun before July 11th, because then he will be a felon in possession. That's number one. But the irony with respect to Hunter is they prosecuted him under a different subsection of that same exact statute, right? It's an addict in possession. And so I think it's kind of ironic here that we're talking about that. And number three is we are going to be talking in a matter of hours, days, or weeks about a case in front of the United States Supreme Court that they're deciding right this very minute as we speak on whether somebody who is a domestic violence, if you are a domestic violence person, you also, that's another prohibited category. Now, the Supreme Court has been narrowing that statute, I shouldn't say that statute, has been narrowing certain, or there's a lot of restrictions that states and others have put on what you can regulate because it's a Second Amendment right. And New York is one of those, right? There was a case, I think it was 2 years ago, that came down, Bruin, which was a United States Supreme Court case that basically said that the way New York State regulated their licensing scheme was unconstitutional. I could see them in the case that's coming before, that's about to come down any minute, saying someone who has a domestic violence history, that's overbroad. Because what does that really mean, right? Every state defines it differently. Some people say domestic violence, you have to be married. Other states say it can be someone who you've been in a relationship with. Some other states say you have to have lived together, right? So they could say that statute's overly broad, or that it applies unevenly and differently depending on what state you are in. And this all leads back to Hunter, because I also think they could say that an addict in possession is also overly vague. And that's because what makes you an addict, right? And do you have to have used drugs that exact day? That's the defense that the defense attorney here, Abby Lowell, who's a very respected, excellent defense attorney, set forth, which is, look, they don't have proof beyond a reasonable doubt that he used drugs that particular day. And calling himself an addict, he'll call himself an addict until the end of time, because that's what psychologically you're taught in AA and NA, right? It's my name is Hunter Biden, and I'm an addict. Like that's the first thing you have to acknowledge, because you'll always be an addict. You'll always be somebody who's struggling with that, but that's more of a psychological definition, as opposed to, are you actively addicted to drugs at that moment? And their argument was they didn't have proof that he was. And I think it was a decent defense, although they didn't buy it and he was convicted. But I think that statute could be potentially in jeopardy, especially depending on how they rule with respect to the domestic violence subsection of the statute. So look, it's a weird case. It's a weird crime. It's a weird charge. I have never heard of it being prosecuted, and most federal prosecutors will say they've never charged this because it is so weird and so vague. It's not like the felon in possession that they do every single day. And look, it's clear here that the only reason he was prosecuted was A, because of his last name, and B, because he wrote a book. If he had not written a book about it and admitted it, they wouldn't have had a case. They wouldn't have even investigated the case. They wouldn't have even have done anything with respect to this case. And, I'm hesitant to say there's a better use of resources and they shouldn't have done this. I've never really bought that. There's no reason to me. Resources are unlimited. Like, I don't know. I don't look at, to me, that's not when you exercise prosecutorial discretion. To me, you exercise prosecutorial discretion if something's in the interest of justice. And to me, what are you going to do? You're going to start prosecuting every single person who uses marijuana, who has a gun? Like, I just can't imagine in this country that you could actually enforce this crime, this law, number one. And number two, I think it's so vague. Again, what is an addict? And I think it's so vague that I don't think this withstands constitutional scrutiny personally. I think the statute, this particular subsection, like it's different from either you're a felon or you're not, right? Like, That's it. And this is so subjective and so strange. It could be defined in different ways by different jurors, right? That to me is the very definition of unconstitutionally vague. The fact that different juries could apply different law to the same facts. So I think this has a serious constitutional issue. I think it's the only reason they brought this case was because of who his father is. And whatever, it is what it is. I also think it's interesting that that Joe Biden, when asked if he'll pardon him, he came out and said no. I don't know why that struck me as odd. I think he wants to show that, you know, he believes in the rule of law, but he didn't say he wouldn't commute his sentence. So if the judge does something crazy and you know, interferes with his recovery by incarcerating him, I could see his dad jumping into dad mode, frankly, and, you know, protecting his son. So who knows what's going to happen? I think it was a weird prosecution. They, you know, had a lot of evidence that they used against him. If I, you know, I don't want to. It's so much easier to be a podcaster and comment on other people's work than it is to do the work yourself. So I'm not going to criticize this phenomenal, excellent lawyer, Abby Lowell, because he knows what he's doing, right? So the question about should you have put on his daughter, I know there was a juror who came forward and said they didn't like that. These are tough calls and tough decisions to make. You know, he's a great lawyer. I think if I were to criticize any part of this, I don't think it should have gone to trial at all. They were in plea negotiations. Yes, they fell apart. I would have done everything I could to get that back on track and not go to trial and not do this case and have it come out. And, you know, I don't know. That's personally as a lawyer what I would have done. But once you're in the heat of battle and at trial, I think he made a really strong argument that I think on appeal could potentially call the statute into question. So
the long national nightmare of Hunter Biden's trial is over. I mean that tongue in cheek. I mean, this is not something that's up. Well, right. But what I mean is that particular one should never have gone to trial. Nobody, like you said, nobody would be prosecuted. I think it's constitutionally infirm, the prosecution to begin with. You're right. The decision we'll get this week or so on the domestic violence application to the Second Amendment will have an impact on it. And we got another case in California that's going to be going forward by the same special counsel about tax issues, where he faces a much graver threat to his liberty. It's about unpaid taxes into the millions during a period of time when he was earning money, and yet again was in the throes of a crack addiction where the money went for inappropriate places. Let's be frank, he's not proud of what he did during his addiction, and it's been well documented. And whether the laptop is right or wrong, no one's ever denied that the photos are what the photos show. But that doesn't mean that the country shouldn't have sympathy and empathy for somebody like Hunter Biden, and who repaid his debt to society, repaid his tax issues. And again, these are not crimes that generally end up in the courtroom. They end up in plea negotiations that, like, as you said, Karen, fell apart in Delaware and fell apart otherwise. It looked like it's an embarrassed special counsel that got his dander up and decided he was going to go after with more verve to nail Hunter Biden, and that's what's happened. But look, I've had friends that have said to me, something about I've had Republican people in my life say things like, "Oh, like father, like son," or some other crazy, ridiculous statements, and I'm like, I'm sorry. At the end of the day, this is the adult child of a person that I voted for president. I didn't really care when Billy Carter urinated on the runway when Jimmy Carter was president. I really didn't care much about what Hillary Rodham Clinton's brother did. I really don't care about any of the relatives. I got my personal opinions that Donald Trump and his kleptocracy has crossed the line using his son-in-law and his daughter to violate the emoluments clause of the Constitution and to make money hand over fist like we never saw in the history of America while he was president. Yes, I have a strong opinion about that. But I'm not going to vote for the president based on what one of his relatives, no matter how close they are, did or didn't do. I like Sasha and Malia. But if it turned out tomorrow that they robbed a bank, it doesn't change my view of Barack Obama or what he accomplished. So like this whole thing, like, we got you. I'm thinking if that's the gotcha that the Republicans have, they're going to be in for a rude awakening on November 5th. If their gotcha is, I saw it in the New York Post today because I have to read the opposition papers. They had a thing. The air of invincibility around the Biden family has finally crumbled with this prosecute. I mean, what are you even talking about? Is this because last week you had a write that Donald Trump's air of invincibility and Teflon Don came crumbling down with under the weight of 34 felony convictions? So you had to sort of balance it out. Is that why? This is a child.
And it's also think about it. Why did it happen? Because he let it. He could have stopped it in its tracks. This is his justice. This is Joe Biden's Justice Department.
Right. And
that's a criminal. That's a criminal.
Right. The whole pardon thing, whether it's clemency down the road or commutation of sentence, will be for another day. But he's not going to pardon him. And that stands in stark contrast because we know that Donald Trump has said, and I don't like to do whataboutism on this podcast. And we don't do that. We don't trade in that. Well, that was wrong. But what about that guy? Okay, so this isn't whataboutism. But Donald Trump has said publicly he's going to pardon Mike Flynn again, Bannon again, Navarro again. If Giuliani gets convicted, he'll be pardoned for federal crimes and the like. And he's just going to hand out like chiclets, like pardons on day one, including for himself. And then you've got a Supreme Court justice like Justice Gorsuch, who thought it was interesting during oral argument about the immunity issue about whether self-pardon was possible. And he didn't say it in a bad way, like, well, self-pardon wouldn't be possible. He was like, self-pardon, that's an interesting concept for another day. Right. Another invitation to a criminal president to use inappropriately powers that he was given by the founding fathers, who never anticipated that we would ever vote for and put back into office a criminal as president. Not only a criminal president, but criminal as president. Oh, I gotta watch my blood pressure these days. So, welcome back. We got to talk about things. Nobody censors what we say on this network. Nobody. I don't blow smoke or sunshine, and you shouldn't expect it here either. Lawyers talking about things, they know what they're talking about at the intersection of law and politics. That is the essence of Legal AF. If you know all about us, take the clip, send it off to people, please, and ask them to join our movement, our audience. If you don't know anything about Legal AF on the MeidasTouch Network, welcome. That was what we do every Wednesday and Saturday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and then on major podcast platforms of your choice. So until my next hot take, until my next Legal AF, this is Michael Popok reporting. Heary, Legal AF Law Breakdown is now in session. Go beyond the headlines and get a deep dive into the important legal concepts you need to know, and we discuss every day on Legal AF. Exclusive content you won't find anywhere else, all for the price of a couple of cups of coffee. Join us at patreon.com/legalaf. That's patreon.com/legalaf.